Welcome to Purpose with Pals, your go-to podcast for unlocking life's true purpose. Join us as we dive deep into the compelling life narratives of guests from all walks of life. Your host, Pals, will guide you on your own journey of self-discovery.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show Purpose with Pals. I'm your BFF Pals, and I am here to bring you incredible guests who will help you decode the purpose of your life. Let's embark on this journey together and discover what truly drives us. I'm super excited to have Ishita on the show today. Ishita is an independent practitioner who wears many hats as a designer, historian, curator, and an educator. She's also working on her own startup that is a fluid collective space curating for culture. Welcome, Ishita, to the show.
Thank you so much, Palak, for having me here.
Thanks, Ishita. So, just to give an overview to whoever has tuned in, is listening either on Spotify or is watching it on YouTube, just to understand how the show is structured today, we will look at Ishita's journey today from being a designer and historian to the founder of her own startup, Curating for Culture. I have also engaged with her startup recently, and maybe we will talk a little bit about that. I did collaborate with her as an artist, and found the collaboration very interesting. We will talk about her major milestones in her career journey so far, and we will talk about how she's building this unique community. And in the end, we will go towards her favorite recommendations of books, shows, films, whatever, Ishita feels like sharing with us. And so stay tuned for all that. And this is going to be an exciting episode. Let's get to know Ishita a little better with some quick questions. So the first question, Ishita, that I want to ask you is, what is your most prized possession as an archivist?
My own diaries and sketchbook from the time I was studying as an interior designer at CEPT University.
Wow, wow, fascinating. So are you, or do you also qualify? Like, do you think you're a hoarder, and is that some trait that that you're collecting old and new things? Is that something that goes with your personality as well?
If there is something called a conscious hoarder, then maybe I qualify as one. So yes, I don't buy, but I do hold on to things which have been passed on to me or something that I've collected on a trail or while I'm traveling. And then there is this conscious effort of, oh, if this holds a meaning in the story that I have to tell, whether it's mine, whether it's my family's, whether it's my work, or whether it's even my friends or relationships, then I do feel that they get preserved or they get kept well. And then there comes a time as well to like go back to things and wonder if it was really worth keeping, and then letting it go as well. So this whole idea of holding on to things until they hold a meaning has been something which has, I think it's been an intuitive trait of mine. Yeah.
I think very fascinating, very fascinating. And I think we will dive deeper into this aspect of it in a bit. And so let's just start with your early influences. Tell me a little bit about, where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? And how did you kind of what did you study? How did you get here? So like a little bit of a journey recap.
Recap. I was brought up in Ahmedabad, born and brought up in Ahmedabad, and it was in Ahmedabad, which was a very small town compared to what Ahmedabad is now. So I must acknowledge the fact that I do feel I am a small town girl. It wasn't a megapolis or a metropolis the way it's growing right now, and that has had a very strong influence. The city was reachable. I intuitively connected to places and spaces, whether it's the park next door, or a recreation, basically a mela, which used to happen around the old house. And then this whole idea of changing homes as the family grew or the aspirations grew. And somehow one could see that each home has a sort of defined, or the stories in each home must have defined some aspects of me. And similarly, I've also had stories with my school. I've only studied in one school, which is Udgam School, but it has changed hands and it has changed places. So it used to be in a bungalow in the city center, and from there it became this another big institution in the suburbs of the city, then the suburbs, of course. And it was all very reputable, it was all very respectable, but I think in the back of your mind, you're wondering, I didn't, sort of ask for this. Why do these changes matter? What's happening? So that's primarily childhood, which was full of questions. I'm brought up in a Jain Gujarati family. So even when it came to faith, when it came to being a middle class child, a middle class family child, having aspirations, but being conscious of what you need to buy, how much you need to have, why you don't have something or why you have something, was always something that was questioned. And I'm happy to say that not complete freedom to ask questions both in the school and in the house, but it wasn't a complete closed door. Or maybe I was a child who wouldn't shut up if you asked me to. And I think that idea of questioning, talking to people, must have led me to thinking about a critical practice which looks at interpretation narratives today. um, yeah, otherwise the schooling was as usual, um, kindergarten to 12th. And in those days, you had to have to take science if you wanted to be in the field of architecture and design. Again, they were not very obvious choices. They just became the second best option. It was a sense of discovery, to be honest, but it was built on the idea that, okay, there has always been a creative spark. I used to make cards for family, friends. I used to write poems. So the family has been observant of the fact that, okay, you do have a creative side. And we know of this kind of an entrance exam where people learn to draw, and that gets them into a course where you can then design buildings and spaces for people. I think I still applied for that entrance exam with a lot of ambiguity, but I think CEPT as a campus, because the entrance exam was inside CEPT campus. And I think that visit to collect the admission forms or to go and give the entrance exam, that's where the whole idea of a space connecting to you and talking to you, calling you, really happened. And then I was like, हाँ, अगर यहाँ पे admission मिल जाता है, I would love to study here. It would be a very different college life. It would be a very different experience, and I would love to make spaces and buildings. But again, I didn't know what the education entailed. I was expecting textbooks, I was expecting exams. So, all of that constant shift of what you anticipate and what's happening to you has also been a part of growing up, especially as a teenager. And a teenager coming from a certain kind of a household, now wanting to think differently, think liberally. Again, these are words which I don't think I knew at that time, but again, the questioning continued, sometimes allowed, sometimes mocked at, sometimes not allowed. But I don't think I really got deterred by it. And every new exposure, I think, or new experience, even in education, really kept my eyes bright and lit up. And yeah, while doing architecture and design, because of this idea of questioning, um, I think I found myself very soon sort of a little critical, or quite a bit critical, about the practices, the contemporary practices, which were, yeah, which were very magazine suited, or which were very elite responsive. And somewhere I think between school and college, one had become very subtly driven towards wanting to contribute, wanting to give back to the society, and not just study and deliver to the larger capitalist market. So when I saw that, oh, architecture and design are sort of into the same trap, I started asking more pertinent questions, I think. My own research projects were somewhere driven around certain questions, which led me to think that, okay, there is scope, or there is an intent to want to write and research about architecture, design, its social responsibility, what is it doing to communities who cannot avail of its service. And that's how I think I started sort of carving a way into research roles. I also wrote for art and architecture and design magazines. Even there, I think I was very grateful to all my editors when I said that I don't want to write only about the product or only appreciate the practice or the building, but actually interview them and write about the process. And that was something. sorry, which was also pedagogically introduced to us. That the process is more important, your values are developed there, your intent becomes clearer, you fight out the politics there, and hence the process is more important than along with maybe or more than the final output. So I got to practice for about, I mean, as a writer, researcher for a year, year and a half, even a documenter of craft practices and communities. And that gave me enough of grounding to say, okay, I would want to strengthen my understanding or reading education more in theory, theoretical writing, and critical thinking. And that's how I went and did my master's in architectural history and theory from the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. And that was now the next level of exposure. The college itself, because of the different departments and the whole interdisciplinary conversations, which was a very strong part of my program, but also the city was thriving with museums, libraries, archives, and access. It was not about only meant, institutions were meant for researchers. It was for people. They used to have events. We attended those. We saw public engage with it. And I think somewhere I was very driven to bring that back to India, to our country. Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about, like, maybe a little bit of what did you pick up like when you went to study abroad? How was it different from the education you had like in India, even though you had like this questioning approach and you've been going back to it again and again, that I picture you as a curious child asking a lot of questions. Sometimes they're entertained, sometimes they're not, and you continue like on your path, you figure out like, something that you want to do around design and architecture, and then there is a shift in terms of city and exposure, and what does it do to you, and how does it open up your world, and if you could go a little bit deeper into that.
That's a very good question, actually. So, two things happened. In the curriculum itself, we were introduced to this idea of an archive. And I remember as a graduating student at CEPT, when I was doing my research thesis and I was looking for data, I used to keep saying that, library is not the only place, library only has published material. Where can I find original documents or original materials in terms of evidence or in terms of interviews? I don't want somebody else's version of story only. I want to investigate it myself. And eventually I did do that for my bachelor's research. I went across the country interviewing and collecting data from about 5 to 7 interior design practices, which was not done before. But I didn't know what it was called. So when we were introduced to this whole idea of go and study the materials in an archive and then build oral histories around it, um, I was like, oh, this is the center or this is the place I was talking about, which holds on to people's memory, people's personal experiences, people's evidence, and allows more people to interrogate it and bring more voices or more narratives around it. So the same drawing or the same document can be studied with different lenses. So even my idea of questioning sort of I think got more stronger, that okay, I do need to have questions, but the questions also come with an agenda or come with a sort of a goal post that you want to answer something or arrive at something. So this whole idea of building a critical inquiry became much clearer through that kind of historical practice or education. Um, I think I'm also remembering, I mean, of course, that it was very interesting that apart from going to museums and seeing exhibitions, which also inspires this entire understanding of being able to question and build narratives around people's histories, about communities, about cultural groups. It was also important to get bit hands-on experience. And that's, again, gratitude to the dean of the program who recommended us to the Royal Institute of British Architects. So we were two Indian students. And it turns out in 20 years of that course, we were the first two Indian students who had made it for that course. So the dean used to watch out, or sort of, yeah, watch out for us a lot. That are you financially taken care of? Are you finding it doable, manageable? So the moment the director of collections, Dr. Irina Murray, reached out to him looking for RAs, research assistants, he suggested both of our names. She was supposed to interview and pick one of us, but seems like she found some strengths which were important in both of us. So we both were on board. And this was for an exhibition on the archival collection of architect Charles Correa. So he happens to be one of the I mean, great would be a very it would be an understatement, but a very a very contributing, a noteworthy architect post-independence in the country. Um, One of the first two or three of them, and the fact that he had given his archival collection to RIBA became a very important question for me. So while I obviously took on the role, it was very exciting that we will be working on Korea's material, and we got to exhibit or be a part of an exhibition in London. And this was the biggest exhibition they have every year. They have a very important exhibition every summer, because summer is the longest exhibition. So apart from a professional joy, which one should have, that, okay, in my resume, I'm going to write that I worked on Charles Correa's exhibition in a prestigious institution like RIBA. I think the key question was, why did he have to send it all the way here? Because before this job that I got on, me and my colleagues were accessing different archives, and we do know that it costs to get hands on to certain good quality prints. So now to imagine that Indian student or Asian students have to give 10 pounds, which is 1,000 rupees, to access data from their own country, it's something that can really at least get to a person like me. And that really did give me a lot of backbone to say, okay, I want to go back to India and talk to people that we need to have an archive in our own country. And long short of it is that we set up India's first architectural archive once I came back. That was with CEPT University. It's 11 years old now. And it's more than 20 collections big, and so many exhibitions, so many oral histories. It's growing and thriving, touch wood. The other important aspect of the curriculum, or the way UCL, or the way I think most of the European education is, that it's very transdisciplinary. So, as I said earlier, the program itself was designed for those who want to get into MPhil and PhD. So, many of our seminars were mixed. PhD scholars worked with us or sat with us, or whenever their juries or vivas happened, we were always invited. But apart from that, if there were things happening in other departments, which is in planning or development, or even let's say somebody's interested in arts and music, you always got to know about it, both through the bulletin boards, but also through curated lists. So if your professor knew or your colleagues knew that this is something that your research interest is about, then they would direct you, guide you towards it. And within our curriculum itself, the theories that we studied were not just limited to architecture. In fact, I don't think there are enough architectural theories. So we did study psychogeography. We read articles about anthropology. We talked about feminism. We talked about urban theories. We looked at the subaltern and the marginalized narratives. That all of that was like blowing your mind open. We also did a lot of site writing or site writing is a practice, and critical theories around it. So what does it mean to do research and then build a critical artwork or a creative artwork? And in fact, that unit was invited to exhibit again within our duration of the course at a forum called Cities Methodologies Forum. So we also took on those roles. So that's something again goes back. So basically, we were invited to do this exhibition as at UCL Cities Methodologies, and again that needed a curatorial team. So six of us formed a curatorial team for that. Similarly, towards the year end, we all were very convinced that even a theory subject should have some participation in the university exhibition. So the moment we said that, then the dean said, I will help you with some funds, but you form a team. So again, few of us, I think more or less the same six people, we formed an editorial team, and we put together perhaps one of the first publications about this program. So I was just saying that it always goes back to the way I was, even the way I was brought up, that yes, I would take charge of things. I might not have experience. I'm okay with making mistakes, failing. But yeah, getting your hands dirty is the best way to learn. And the moment we did that, now we out of the 14 people bunch, first of all, 14 people were from different countries, different backgrounds. So we were all not architects. I was an interior designer. We had architects in the room. We had artists or art historians in the room. I think one or two of them were also from journalism. So we were already learning so much from each other. The moment we became these smaller groups of who worked on projects, we learned, fought, snatched each other's hair. But again, we learned so much in terms of understanding where somebody else came from. So, this whole idea that transdisciplinary practice can guide your worldviews, can guide your practice, expand and compress its scope as and when needed, I think became a very important takeaway once I got back. I didn't want to compromise on that learning curve because I still feel I'm learning. I mean, it's constantly growing with the way curating for culture has become a space for more and more practitioners to come on board, or more and more expertise to come on board.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we will go deeper into this because I am fascinated with the work that you're doing with curating for culture. But I want to kind of like take a step back. And since you told us about whole of your journey of going from design and architecture to going to like, this university, which gave you a lot of exposure, helped you form your worldview, gave you a network of peers to kind of work with. So if people who are listening in and are looking to like start their journey in this practice, what would be your like what would be your guidance to them? What are the things that they can look at to figure out, because this also has many divisions in that sense. While you're talking, I can see you could be like in architecture, you could be an archivist, you could be a designer, and you specialize in interior design, as you said. So if you could just give like a little bit of overview of how to go about thinking of how to find your purpose. So essentially the episode is about finding your purpose. So how do you find what is it that you're good at, and how do you kind of take it forward? So if you could just like talk a little bit about that.
I'm definitely speaking from the top of my head, but I'm very convinced about what I'm going to say. I think purpose is not a very stagnant entity. And I think that's been my clue, or my guiding light, that my purpose, and if you see now the story that I told you, my purpose during my interior design was to actually perhaps prove or find myself as a design researcher and a writer. So taking up a subject of that caliber, getting definitely pushed and pulled around, not finding data, finding methods to address it. Of course, there must have been shortcomings in the way I wrote to people or I read into materials. I was not so much into reading then, for sure, or at least the reading I used to do was more of fiction or life stories. It was not about reading design histories. So pushing your boundaries in that moment to define that purpose has been the guiding light or the cue. Because from there, then finding roles as a researcher and a writer, I always knew that that was not the final goal. But that purpose definitely had shifted a little bit. That okay, I did do a nice research thesis, according to me, nice. And can this really add to a active, thriving practice? There were two methods or two approaches in my head. One was working with the research center, but I was also in conversation with an interior designer, very established interior designer from Mumbai, who was also my guide, that I could actually help her practice in putting their work down, documenting it, making presentations, articulating it for other articles or magazines, write ups. And I don't think I'm very far away from that. So now I do actually help architectural and interior design practices archive, write about their work, put publications together, or put exhibitions together. So even though I chose path A and not path two, but you do come around, and it sort of the purpose does sort of keep shifting, keep meeting the ends that you're thinking of. And I think the second important purpose, I think, or the second significant purpose for me then has been this whole idea of wanting to work with underrepresented stories. Now, I don't think, again, I started with it. I was writing papers about it during my master's, but I don't think I was seeing beyond architecture and design. That itself has a lot to do. I don't think even now enough is done. But because I started somewhere in my research papers to address it, I don't think I was doing very fairly well. Though my professors didn't complain, I know I could have done better. But there was a difference between the standards in UK versus the way you are taught writing here. You're taught research, or very little research is taught in the country, versus you are sitting in the epicenter of research and academia. So I was doing not so well, but yeah, again, that push and pull of, yes, I do want to find ways to study or write about underrepresented narratives. What will be my tools? What will be my theories? Who are the right professors? I know I made my evaluation between different professors, methods that they showed me. Um, the actual, I think the goalpost became setting up sept archives, because when we set up sept archives, we were not looking at the first five famous architects, but we knew that in for 70 years of India's independent history, there were so many other architects who have been, and hardly people know about them or their stories, or maybe only few buildings get seen because of media or popular media, and so much more gets left out. And that work further extended in looking at women in architecture. Again, we have done an digital archive. We have got 21 oral histories of women architects, and we are very aware of the fact that we have not even scratched the surface. There's so much more work to do. And what I think what I'm getting at is that purpose for me, especially, and I'm not somebody who has really put that, list or a goal checklist on the doors of their room and said, oh, I need to become this, then I need to become this, then I need to get this. It's really been about what is my truth right now. And that truth might not come from a comfortable space, but this is what really feels like my calling. Let me address that. Let that calling then guide me to the next one. So, this whole idea that everyone feels that you'll find this one purpose and that's it done, I think that's somewhere I would find it very problematic to dedicate your life to just one big goal. I would rather break it down into smaller goals, and then, yeah, let's see what it assimilates into. Practically, anybody who wants to apply into these fields will need to explore practice as much as they need to be into research, writing, theoretical studies. I do feel that academia has its own position, theoretical reading and writing has its own position. It has perhaps had more value in the past, and in the times that we are in now, and where we are heading, my mind always felt that there needs to be more practice, there needs to be more hands-on work, there needs to be more conversations, there needs to be more interactivity, more embodied form of making sense of all these theories, rather than only doing research, writing, and publishing papers and PhDs. But yes, I mean, all sides of that career or this coin are important. So one could begin on one side and arrive at the other. One thing I like about this field is that yes, it already allows when it comes to intake. It already allows people to come from different disciplines. It has very little silos, basically, to say that, okay, if you're an architect, only then you can do architectural history. No. So that is where I think there is a lot of room for people to explore, experiment, and find their niche, basically.
And I really resonate with what you spoke about in terms of purpose and how it kind of keeps evolving. And if you are just like, where you are, and if you can keep finding where you want to go from there, instead of like looking at like, it's great to have a bigger picture, but like having like those immediate steps that you can take, and then like later kind of see how that your journey is getting connected. And it's fascinating that how like that how you have moved in the same field and like kind of found like your own little niche there. And so I think I want to go a little bit deeper into how do you select the, like, now coming a little bit to your startup, and let's talk a little bit more about what does curating for culture does, and what is the kind of like archiving projects that you're focusing on and curations that you're focusing on. And if somebody also, I want you to talk in a little bit of a layman's term, in if they're not even like from this field, for people to understand what exactly are you doing and how are you kind of preserving the cultural narrative, and what kind of cultural narrative are you like looking at preserve.
I think so. I'll backtrace the story and complete the journey or the curve for even everyone to understand, but more perhaps for those who may not relate to this field. So, setting up of SEPTA archives basically meant meeting architects and convincing them to donate or allow us to digitize all their archival material. Now, what it includes drawings, blueprints, the way people know how buildings are made, but it also includes a lot of other memorabilia. So, which means the letters, the bills that they might have made, if they got published about, if they got awards, if they were into any kind of controversial or difficult situations which might have affected the project. Why I'm highlighting this is that apart from evidence which is directly related to somebody's practice or life, there is always ancillary or external or other materials which may not even get preserved, which is completely fine, but that memory or that memory tracing is equally important. So, one of the key things that was crucial to our process then and even now has been oral history recording. So, we have sat with architects, but afterwards with many other community members for hours and hours trying to trace 80 years of their life. And it's just fascinating to see how personal and professional intertwine, how places affect them, how their economic situations, their socio-political views, their religious affinities, all of this affects the work that we all do. And this is another way to put it when I would say that culture is itself such a shape-shifting entity that to be very decisive or to have very a very head-on approach to saying ये प्रोजेक्ट ऐसे ही होगा या मेरी लाइफ ऐसे ही होगी और मैं यहाँ तक पहुंचूंगा या पहुंचूंगी आई थिंक इट्स अ बिट प्रॉब्लमैटिक I do feel that maybe I'm okay if IT professionals or medicine professionals disagree with me. Maybe over there, because it's guided by science and tech, things are a bit more linear if you want to, or you can try to hold it. But I think when it comes to cultural practice or artistic practice, at least artist friends would agree, it's very difficult to try and contain it. The more you try and contain it, the more it slips out of your hand. So one realized this while doing very early on archiving work. We were very open-minded. We allowed for 2, 3 projects to inform each other. Projects or the processes of archiving also evolved because there was no precedent in the country for what an architectural archive should be. So we went to very different kinds of archives abroad and in India to understand their processes. But then what is the best suited method that we could set up in Sept archives with the resources that we had? We worked with that kind of an approach, very malleable, but still maintaining a discipline and a decorum. And once that was set up, I think one of the goals or purpose at that time for me became that this is a practice of a historian, very much so. So I fulfilled that. But I've always also had a question again as a student of design, why doesn't history talk to heritage? I could very well see that historians and heritage practitioners do have their own silos, and sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't. They may be taught similar processes, they may not be taught, and there is a lot of value in exchange between those two. So I thought instead of course, asking questions, why not try it? And that's why I started looking for roles in heritage practice to even test it out and see if my understanding falls through or not. And yeah, to my happy surprise, I landed in Shishti Institute of Art Design and Technology. I came in as a researcher, but very soon I was made the UNESCO Chair Coordinator. And the focus of the UNESCO Chair was in culture, habitat, and sustainable development. These are influenced from the 12 SDGs set out by UNESCO. And the focus of this chair was to work with historic towns in Karnataka. So, me being a migrant, having to learn about new cultures, I think I was the perfect fit. I came with very little bias, and so did my students. These were courses which were taught I mean, practice-based teaching courses. So we would embark onto expeditions in historic towns with, of course, a module or a subject in focus. Either they were doing ethnography and narrative building, either they had to focus on cultural and creative practices. But what was fascinating that none of these places have been documented, studied enough, or even yeah, I don't think there's any resource about them. So all our modules were based on the foundation of documenting, collecting, building a repository AKA, which could be called forming archives. And when I saw that, okay, as a historian, I didn't have to do much. I just had to bring the archiving practice or the practice of a documenter to build conversations around heritage practice or heritage preservation. And then further that work, basically data collection is not enough. You also need to be able to question it, see it through right lenses or appropriate lenses, which I was constantly mentioning earlier, that this act of questioning becomes very important. None of this is very discipline specific as such. So we had students who were from tech, from engineering. We had students who were from business histories, and they wanted to look at heritage sites as entrepreneurship models or as places of engineering and technological innovation. So none of this was very confined to any one domain. It became very transdisciplinary for people to bring in ideas, argue with each other. So when we even started building these projects to a certain extent, we ourselves took it to public engagement. So we did participate in the ICOMOS Global Assembly. ICOMOS is a scientific organization which looks at monuments and sites, and they were holding an international global assembly in Delhi. And we were able to showcase some of the student projects there. We also did something called Interlude, which was a space for winter courses at Shishti. And we were able to do a conference at IISc in Bangalore. And what I'm getting to over here is that we constantly found our own ways to engage the public and clarify, perhaps for both parties involved or all stakeholders involved, that this is not related to any one discipline. And we have constantly got that kind of a response from the public or the audience that, I don't have to be a designer or a historian to understand why the community in Hampi needs to be helped with the preservation initiatives, or why the temple site in Hampi should not be locked down for tourism or from archaeological point of view. They would understand why the community in Joke Falls would get affected if the natural tendency of Joke Falls was converted against the ideas of conservation. So we were able to take these very complex looking cultural settings, nature culture relationships, community relationships, and talk about its authenticity or its ownership and its connectivity to its landscape, and how preservation. So basically, what I was getting at is the fact that we have been able to take these complex cultural situations or exercises from history to heritage to public engagement, and use creative practice to communicate, to decode, to just understand what another community is going through. And of course, from there on, we would expect experts or professionals who will do more conservation work, who will do more scientific work. But this platform that one arrived at, which is a platform where you can facilitate conversations between different communities, different people coming from very different walks of life, to understand each other, to connect with each other, to empathize, because we are constantly told and we live with that narrative that we are very culturally diverse and different, which is not a problem. It just needs more effort in terms of understanding each other, connecting with each other through memory, through lived histories, through interpretation of those lived histories, through questioning the belief systems, through questioning what's been written years ago, etc. So, all of these tools sort of coming together is what formed the practice. And one understood that this is what a curator does. But I also was very nervous to call myself a curator, because for a very long time, the world has known curator as the curator of an art gallery, who has a very different responsibility of selling art, of identifying art, of taking them and putting them on pedestals. And I think the practice that I was talking about was coming from a much more humble space of saying that we want to care for people's narratives. We want to bring people in conversation with each other. They will not like things about each other. There will be ethical differences. So there will be a lot of creating of a safe space required, a lot of curation of emotions and experiences and approaches required. We may go wrong. So all I'm trying to say is that then the verb curating made more sense than, first calling yourself a curator and claiming the space. Just to say that cultural preservation needs a space of curating. Of course, eventually I did see the sort of epistemology and understood that curate also means to care and care for a collection of objects or of things. But we are taking it from there and all the way into caring for communities, for people, for their well-being, for their cultural understanding of themselves and then of others. So yeah, when I thought of setting up an independent practice, I moved on from Shishti Institute and my role at the UNESCO chair. It was just very simple to say, okay, I'm creating a platform. It's not so much of a personal practice alone. It will always be a we, it will always be a community who will need to come together, shape it, shift it, challenge it, take it places or break it. And that is how Curating for Culture as a collective fluid space came into being. It is not an organization, it is not a registered entity. It is literally a space where many different people have come and launched their projects, as you have also done. They have workshopped with us and taken approaches and built their own projects or their own entities. They've gone back into studies. They have continued to teach, but then take these processes into teaching. We also teach and mentor at Curating for Culture, depending on where we are invited or what we feel is important to float as a workshop or as a learning engagement space. Yeah, that's Curating for Culture. And very simple answer to how we look for projects, we don't look. The approach has been very contextual, very similar to my answer about purpose building. Purpose building has been very context responsive, which means my age, my mind, my surroundings, my family situation, my social situation. I think Curating for Culture is more or less resonating the same vibe. We started in the pandemic, and the need of the hour was to help people um, get through whatever it was. At that point, of course, we all didn't know what it was or what it would feel like. Archiving as a practice could open up this whole possibility of belonging, possibility of connecting with people around you. So until then, one was doing archiving for communities, for heritage projects, and then we just went across the screen and offered archiving as smaller workshops for personal or family archiving. And from there, it has grown into a 6 months long incubation program, which happens every 2 years. We have guided over 50 plus micro archiving projects so far across South Asia. We have CPA itself has had its own offshoots, either in the form of public exhibitions or being invited to another institution and then do a health histories workshop and an exhibition with St. John's Hospital, or be invited to Bangalore Design Week, where we responded to the context of Bangalore and we invited the community to share migration histories. And all of this is a commentary, is a comment to the socio-political narrative that we are in. So two climates I think we particularly respond to. One is the climate, whether it is health, whether it is weather, and how could we help in such sensitive situations. But on the other hand is the socio-political climate, which is constantly trying to homogenize us, which is constantly trying to make us as a society more and more intolerant to each other. And we do feel that this our practice at a very micro level is trying to break that. It's trying to make room for people to understand each other, tolerate each other, connect with each other, despite all the cultural, socio-cultural differences. And in that process, we continue to excavate, unearth, and make invisible histories visible.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating, yeah, Ishita. And I have been myself part of like two of the projects that you have mentioned. One was COVID histories, wherein and I also got curious about like this process of how do you archive, how do you look at, and I was looking at, because I don't come from the field itself, I was looking at like I was participating from the perspective of personal history and bringing it in. So the project that you mentioned about the health histories as well, and the focus that I was looking at was mental health and unemployment, and really, like, what was very fascinating for me in both the projects was this and how you have also been talking about like creating a safe space and having these conversations in the public. So and both the times that I kind of participated, I felt that those conversations were happening somewhere in silos, and it was not like, there was, I did not find that community or a group of people who were actually looking at that stage or process, or were open to discuss, something like health histories. And this was from the perspective, especially if I talk about health histories, which was from the perspectives of the community and showcasing it to the medical fraternity. And I think that was a very fascinating take, like, because a lot of people ask me, oh, so where are you putting up, like, this art piece? And I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be in a hospital. And they're like, what? Like, there was this connections that you're making, like, those, if you could just like talk a little bit more about this. And I know you have spoken about it a lot, but if you could give me like, like some tangible examples as well. Like, for example, one is health histories, one was the COVID project, and how you got like, how you're getting these multiple stakeholders to have these important conversations, which would not happen if, like, that bridge is not made, and how you are like,
Hmm.
so if you could just throw a little bit of more light on that.
So there are two important aspects to the way the process is getting built, or the system is getting built. One is whether you call them collaborators or call them patrons who are bringing the project, right? So we are doing CPA or we are doing personal archiving workshops. Either they emerge from there, they are participants of it, or they are seeing the work that is happening at CPA, and then they're asking us, would you want to look at help us look at our family's history in terms of plantation estates, or the other project which you know about is Patni Archives. They came in as a very strong shot collaborator, even though they started as participants. But Avni basically then converted the relationship into a long-standing collaboration where we are also growing and changing the scope of that project. While it started as papers and materials of an erstwhile Diwan's office, today, 4.5 years down the line, it's a cultural resource center in the city of Bhavnagar, where you can find information about the Diwan and his office, but also over 6,000 historic books in his library. There are papers and materials about subjects ranging from business history to port administration, to independence movement, to Swadeshi movement. And now that we're looking at the photography collection, you can even get into the whole artistic conversation about material, medium, photography, and travel and the different cultural subjects that the family engaged with. Because there are certain family members who are interested in documenting nature, and then there are certain family members who have taken a lot of photography, or developed a lot of photography around cultural ceremonies and rituals in Bhavnagar. So you can imagine that once such a collaborator comes on board, you get the support in terms of scoping it. I mean, the other collaborator whom I should recognize, especially because you mentioned archiving health histories, it's Radhika. Radhika Hegde is curator of the museum at St. John's Hospital. And it's not like the museum doesn't have enough archives and materials to work with. But for her to also recognize that this is all still coming from the clinical, the scientific background, and we do need the intangible, the narrative material. And that's where she invites me to say, let's put down a workshop and see if we can add more lived experiences to a museum like this, which is otherwise expected to have scientific gears, scientific memory, scientific documentation. But can it also have cultural memory and cultural inputs about health and medicine and science? Um, so one part of the system is patrons or collaborators who have trusted this process, because we don't necessarily practice very mainstream, very scientific archiving, and that's why I am very careful of not being introduced as an archivist. I'm a very much an accidental archivist. The interest has been to, in fact, subvert the classical model of an archive, because it's very rigid, it's very black and white grid like, that you will basically list down all your items, you will list down all its metadata in the y-axis, and here it is, here are the 5 photographs in the archive. No, the 5 photographs connect with 5 other interviews, they might connect with 2 other letters. It's a network of memories and stories. So the moment we are approaching it from there, we are trying to subvert the classical model of an archive. And these patrons and collaborators have recognized the value of it, or at least wanted to invest into that kind of a process and see what will come of it. Even Queer India Archives, um, queering itself and queer life itself means to be to be more fluid, to be more agile, to not fall into any sector or a segment. So again, for Queer India Archives, while it's of course very important to have a structure, because we're going to put together so many different collections of people's histories from different locations across India, from different time periods. They themselves might have very different or contrasting belief systems. So when it all comes under one umbrella, yes, there needs to be some coherence, but not at the cost of the actual agility of cultural histories and cultural narratives. The second important aspect has been the world out there. So I know we are still not reaching a major audience, because we're not really a very influencer based startup or a setup. Um, Neither have we been able to invest into those kind of resources, because this is a not for profit kind of a setup. But we do always put things out as an open call. So our approach or our value system at C4C has been very little about putting eligibility criterias, putting demarcations, putting qualifiers, because again, we are trying to see the system differently than institutions. Institutions are already doing that. They need to create brackets. So certain fellowships are only open for people until 35. Certain fellowships are only open for marginalized communities. We are not in either of these spaces. We can't make exclusive programs, even for right now marginalized communities, because we really don't know how to reach them and how will we provide resources to them. Nor do we want to only be rooted in the urban community. And that is why we try and do a lot of effort, and I do know that there are other community members who carry the voice, but they proliferate or they sort of propagate the open calls. And most of our projects have been done through open calls. So we do what we can do. If we are, let's say, about reaching 5,000, 6,000 people, then I know out of that 5,000 people, at least another 1,000 people are telling another 2,000 people. And that's how people, as you were looking for, those who are looking for this community, for them, it becomes a clickbait, that, oh, I was looking for this kind of a space, and here they are doing such a workshop, or here they're doing or providing such a platform. Let me enroll in it and see. And then of course, I'm hopeful that they must also be going through our website or our social media, evaluating the way we work. Some of them obviously come into the programs and realize that some things may work for them, may not work for them. So a lot of it is exploratory in that sense. But yes, this system or this community coming together is the community itself. So we are riding on the backs of each other, if I put it as simply as that.
Yeah.
One important thing that we do actively work with is put in resources or get volunteering help to be able to communicate in more languages. So while this conversation itself is only happening in English, and I tried to seep in a little bit of Hindi, but otherwise consciously, even when I'm teaching now, or we do workshops, or we put out these open calls, we try and make it in as many languages possible, depending on the strengths of the stakeholder. So we don't want to translate and have mistakes in it. We are equally careful of that. But if you remember COVID-19, the archiving pandemic in India, we had been able to put out the open call in 9 languages. And that's because so many volunteers offered that I can help you do it in Bangla, I can help you do it in Kannada, somebody did it in Telugu for us. And we couldn't be more grateful that people do see value in what we're trying to do. We are ourselves also equally flexible. So when it comes to making applications to us, people who enroll with us, they are most welcome to tell us that I am not comfortable with English. And we find ways to work with other languages or other mediums, which could be audiovisual, which could be written, which could be embodied, so that language or those kind of technicalities are not coming in the way for more and more people to participate and interact and build this community together.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And great that you brought this point up, because I think my next question was about like how, like, it's inclusive spaces, inclusivity and accessibility. And I wanted you to touch upon these two things as well, because you're working with urban audiences as well as rural audiences. You are engaging with the creators, or like, people who are bringing in these histories. Of course, localization, like, there is a, like, language is a barrier, and you're trying to kind of like, make it more accessible in a manner. And how, at least from my perspective, it seems like these two, like accessibility and inclusivity, is that somewhere, like, I see in most of the projects that are that you end up taking in terms of curating for culture. And if you could talk a little bit more about that. And yeah.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I mean, it's just that at least in today's conversation, I didn't introduce curating for culture as a very, in a very academic way, if I put it like that. But if otherwise I have to explain curating for culture, it is about being hinged onto two aspects, which is inclusion and access. And they have literally become yin yang, if I call them so, because the more we want to include people and we want to include different kinds of histories, we need to devise more methods of access. And that's what I was talking about, which is languages, which is different forms of media. When you think about the archives that we are creating and we want to make them more accessible, we then work with inclusion in terms of team members, in terms of tools and methods, which allows inclusion, which allows, and a very good example is that the practice sort of has a very strong rooted behavior or a very strong rooted interest in physical work or on-site work, but it has sort of taken off and found a very equally grounding space in the online or in the virtual, and constantly exploring technological solutions without, of course, compromising any of the ethical concerns about privacy, about content infringement. And that is why I think, again, when I say that, okay, we are not very hyped up on social media, because that's coming to us as a tool. It's not what we are making the material, or we're not building this practice for. The practice is still being built for people to actually engage with an archive the way it should be engaged with that seriousness, but with that enthusiasm. Come to a place in Bhavnagar, sit in the library, access the materials. Come to Ahmedabad, sit in SEPTA archives, study the exhibitions. Or even when we have made digital archives, when we have made Women of Vastukala, it's completely accessible online. You can actually listen to different parts. We have annotated it so you know which recording might be of interest to you. Make your notes, but the disclaimers are mentioned that you should not obviously make any copies of these recordings or use them without the information of the contributors or the women architects themselves. And these are not just instructions for people. We ourselves also follow it. And if anybody has ever called out, okay, you should have not used a material without letting us know, we immediately backtrace it if that mistake has happened on our end, and we become ultra careful of not making that mistake again. So access and inclusion very much go hand in hand. It constantly needs us to think of more tools, more approaches. I don't think we have a very set method, because each project needs us to think about inclusion in many different ways. So a family archiving project needed all family members to get included. So in Patni Archives, we've done over 14 oral histories in the phase one, and we have more oral histories to conduct to get more versions of the narrative of the Divan's work and his journey. Whereas when you look at Queer India archives, it might just be the person themselves because they're all still alive. But we want to approach their narrative from more perspectives. So if they have mentioned two or three people who are very important to their life history, apart from the main oral history, we would also do interviews of the people associated with their life. We would also invest our energies into extended documentation, because one of the things that's happening with a lot of lost histories is that they're lost. So there is no evidence. And one would want to invest time and energy and resources to actually go back to their old houses, go back to the place of cruising, go back to their schools, or even their older work organizations, and pull out materials which would complete their life history. So we go extra mile every time, and then we realize there's another extra mile to go to get a sense of a complete history, which itself is a myth. There's never a complete history or a complete narrative, but that's the excitement that you're always looking for, digging for, and inclusion in that sense is a very deep bottomed vessel, and it's exciting. The more and more you include, the more voices, the more perspectives, the same story sort of surprises you, gives you new ideas. Very important aspect to this relationship, why they go hand in hand, because it strengthens the idea of custodianship. So one of the things, or one of the values that we are working with is these micro archives. Because they're micro, hopefully we are not really becoming responsible for them. We're genuinely just providing a platform. People do presume that अच्छा हमने archive किया तो अब हमारे पास आ गया. We don't even have a building or a place or an office for curating for culture yet. Our idea is that we want to empower or enable, both actually, empower and enable community or community members to be able to safeguard their material. And that is why inclusion of more people, so that they build their own mini networks or micro networks to safeguard the material. That becomes important. And the moment you will be able to give more access to the material, it becomes a cyclic relationship. अगर access है, if people are using your archives, they see value in your archives, in the narratives that you are sharing, safeguarding it, taking care of it becomes exciting, becomes sustainable. So this whole access and inclusion, empowering and enabling, and then finally custodianship and sustainability. These are the hooks and keys which forms the sort of the chain around this system.
Wonderful. And I think you've explained it also really well. And I think now I want to move a little bit towards like making it a little bit more personal, and what are the challenges that you as a young woman leader face while, like, doing this practice. It could be your everyday challenges, it could be like, larger challenges that you may be facing, if there's anything that you want to talk
I
about.
think resource management is the key, and I don't think I'm only talking about funds, which is obviously there, but I think it's enough known for the world that cultural projects or artistic projects are always looking for enough funds or patronage, and it's always a stretch. But I think there is more to resource management now. One is resources in terms of time and skills. So while a lot of younger folks, even senior folks who are interested in working with us, not everybody has the bandwidth or the patience it takes for a slow immersive practice, or is able to connect with the material. So we need, while we are doing our own form of incubation and mentoring, I do feel if there were a few more courses or organizations which could train people, then we can focus on projects and they can focus on teaching. So that is one aspect of resources. Second aspect of resource management is also that how much ever one tries, this is a material intensive field, and we are underlying as an undercurrent. We are very conscious of the ecological footprint of this practice. And again, over there, if there were ways that we could collaborate with the right organizations, find ways to repurpose our materials. We are doing it in our own little ways, but I think we do find it challenging, or maybe we need to make a system for it, that the posters that we make, or any other test prints that we make, or any other archival grade boxes that we need require. Every archive is not going to be able to afford the boxes which come at a very high cost from Europe. Can we make iterations or versions of it? While I'm identifying this as a challenge, I also have to accept that we are meeting collaborators or experts who are slowly guiding us in the process, or they are guiding the archives, and then we learn along with them. But I think it's a long way to go in terms of resource management, because everything obviously then comes down to funds also. So how much will somebody guide you pro bono? After a point, you want to give them a certain fee, or you want to engage with them long term and experiment a little bit longer. And that's where funding becomes very important. Um, Funding also becomes important because, as I said, we do ask our participants or community members to continue to care for their archives, and sooner or later they do feel stretched with the funding as well. And why should it be that everybody has to do it only through formal methods, right? So there is funding now in the cultural sector, but it always comes with, are you a PhD scholar? Are you an established organization? Do you have FCRA, etc., etc.? And the scene with FCRA has already gotten way more trickier in the last 4 3 4 years. So every organization is not able to avail of grants and fellowships and scholarships, or even individuals cannot. So finding more non-institutional or subversive or flexible ways of getting support is going to be more and more crucial. Um, any other challenge? Not really. I think, yeah, I mean, it would be too idealistic to say otherwise. The practice has its own challenges because it's not a very repetitive practice. So I'm not sitting with three PowerPoint presentations and saying, okay, which one should I show or sell? Every project needs us to start afresh, think afresh. But I think as a creative professional, that's what gives me the kick. I would get very bored if I was copy pasting a process. Um, so that comes with a challenge. It needs a lot more time. It needs a lot more intensity, a lot more care for your own self, and all of that. But I'm very grateful that either I found my own systems, or there is a community out there. We do care for each other. There is enough artistic or creative inspiration around in this field. So you also get to be in those spaces or bounce off your questions and your anxieties. And I think the last point about this anxiety is the cultural fragility, which I mentioned earlier also. That while we're doing all of this, and then when we see that the world wants to go to war every now and then, or people are ready to kill each other just because you ate a wrong food item, that really sort of, sort of some days puts sort of a pause onto the whole practice, and like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? People don't even care about people. But then that same practice the next morning gives us the hope, because we remember the better experiences of participants who have worked with each other, who have cared for each other without even getting into caste, ethnicity, religion, gender. So yeah, the same practice sort of toggles our heart, and the same practice then heals it also. So I think it's a part of being in this process. No, not such challenges. I think as a woman practitioner, I think I have had my share of stuff, but that's a little way back in time now. I don't think I face it or feel it anymore. I mean, happy to say I've overcome it. And then if it happens in micro situations in a print shop, or in a coffee shop, then I think I've grown up enough to sort of call it out myself and say, भैया आप check मुझे दे सकते हो, भले ही सामने लड़का बैठा है. So I think now these are more imbibed ways of living. They don't really get to you anymore. But yeah, those days have happened, like for every other woman practitioner. They've happened for me also.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And I think now I'm just moving to few of my last questions for you. And the last being, what is the, like, I think a lot of times we are going through like tough situations in life, and it's like going through a failure, setback, like, if you could just talk about like, something that you have dealt with personally and how you overcame it. And this is one of my favorite question to ask guests, because I kind of want like to end it on a hopeful, more motivating note. And if you could, like, look at your own life story and like kind of connect it to that.
Oh, so many. I mean, that's something. I mean, when you even asked me about school and childhood and growing up, that's something which comes to my mind first, even now. Quite a bit of a dark childhood, and I'm okay with now accepting it. Um, and I think what I've understood coming this far off is something that you can believe in, something that holds your faith, whether it's humanity, whether it's goodness, whether it's kindness, whether it's good food. I do feel food has a very important role to play. Whether it's the idea of any one interest in your life, because I do know music heals me and dance elevates me, and none of this is for the world. I mean, these are all personal passions. At one point, of course, writing poetry was equally a part of it, of expression. It's just that I've reached that sweet spot of I write too much for my work, so I don't write for myself. But I just feel that all of these activities at some point in the time, and now of course drawing and painting, they do actively help. So not just do them because you're passionate, or because you have to have a hobby, but do it because it heals you, it connects you, it resolves situations of your past or even of your present. And on the other hand, having something that you believe in, even if you're an atheist or even if you're an agnostic person, there'll be something that gives you a grounding feeling. Find out, if and even if it means it's walking on the grass versus walking on the floor, and if that calms you down, grounds you, finding it out, and then obviously putting in effort to get to it on the bad days, on the difficult days, is your only job. That's it. And then let it do its work, even if it means that you might work for 5 hours on the grass and you might still lie in the bed for another 5 days, but that effort of getting up and getting on the grass will matter to you on the sixth day or the seventh day. um, yeah, experiencing that and allowing that to do things to you, to change, is very important to get through difficult times, whether it's from the past, whether it's current, or whether it's whatever comes next in the future.
That
I wouldn't even mind, I mean, saying this along with all of these philosophical and creative answers. Go get help if you need help. There is no doubt about it. When I had my difficult times, unknowingly, knowingly, I found people to talk to. Even maybe didn't the talking might have not really constructively worked, because not everybody has the same level of understanding, maturity. But the fact that I am a conversational person, I've seen merit in conversations a lot. So whether it's to address a situation in work life, whether it's to address a situation in relationships, you might not be able to resolve it. You might have to ultimately accept to let it go. But the fact that you got it out there, confronted, try to have a conversation, has been very, very, very important. And I do see it now, relating to medical intervention. So when you have difficult days, and if you feel that somebody medically, or somebody trained, or somebody who has a bit more experience in that area of matter, in that area of work, or in that area of life, try sharing it with them. Obviously, way to create a safe space and build that trust, but act on it. There is no harm in doing that. I think we have also been a very, very strong culture of keeping things to ourselves. And I think the practice that we are building over here is about slowly letting those boundaries go. Yes, you can have private life. Yes, you can have things that you keep to yourself. But if it is not helping you, if it is hurting you, if it is not letting you go out there and be there for yourself, then it's not healthy. And that's where I do feel that we need to change that as a society, as a culture. Talk to people, share your histories, share your experiences, and see how they are met with. Not all the sharing will be good, but the more you will share, the more you will explore and understand.
Yeah.
That's the biggest hope.
Yeah, I think all of those suggestions are wonderful to kind of connect with oneself, to do all of those things, and to also reach out when you need help. So I think,
Yes.
and to keep going on. I love that part.
Yeah,
You said
it's a
like,
continuous process.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like even
It's
after 5 days,
just the
6 days,
way.
just get up and
Just the way we take medicines, right? So it might cure your sneeze and cold for this month, but the next rains you might get it again, and you will take another round of pills, right?
yeah,
If that's there, then same happens with mental health or personal life. If you do need to speak about the same problem one more time, it's hitting you again, or it's being dealt with differently. Repeat the cycle. Yeah, one day music will help you, one day dance will help you, one day painting will help you.
yeah. And that's what leads me to the next question. Your recommendations about books, films, TV shows, anything that like you would want to share.
Oh wow, that's a huge list. Now, somebody who has told you so much about, I do watch a lot of stuff. I read once in a while. I'm a slow reader, but I do. How much can I recommend? Okay, I'll just go with what comes on the top of my head, but I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list. Tuesdays with Muri is a book I really go back to every now and then. Just pick up a page and it always leaves me inspired. Primarily, I think because it's lived experiences and it's very conversational. Then I think of Why Loiter a lot. It looks like a very serious feminist reading. It is a feminist reading, but it's not so serious. It's really fun to experience what freedom for women in public spaces would feel like. But in the process, of course, it questions the lack of that. But it takes you through Bombay and Delhi in very interesting ways. I also recommend the current book which I'm reading. It's been a while. I've not finished it, but Tomb of Sands by Gitanjali Shri. It's a big book, but it's very easy to read. But a lot is happening. It's really like a film packed inside a book, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody going to make a film on this any day. But I like that there are many creative styles which have been explored. So I think I have really come a long way from reading life histories or just non-fiction to reading fiction, which is very strongly intertwined with reality. And there's a lot more in terms of creative pursuit, in terms of writing. So I do feel such books really appeal to me. But yeah, I'm sure there are more which I can't. I also really enjoyed reading the autobiography on or biography of Girish Karnad, and that also took me through places and politics that he lived through, and the socio-cultural tastes of being a Girish Karnad in a country like India. I think these are very important experiences to leave us all inspired and hopeful. Things to watch. That's genuinely very difficult because at least you might resonate with me, but where the generation was moved from TV to cinema houses to OTT, I do feel a lot has happened to us as far as watching stuff is concerned. Um, but I've always been somebody who has really liked the offbeat content, even if it sometimes doesn't make sense to me. I have to accept that. So I do know watching. I forget the name of that film, Fir Zindagi or something, which was Abhishek Bachchan, and that film was about AIDS. And I know I was very young to watch it. I don't even think I was allowed to watch it. I don't know how I watched it, but I do know that movie makes more meaning to me now. But I'm glad that I'd watched it at an earlier age. Similarly, Monsoon Wedding, and Hazaro Khwaishein Aisi, and then even now, if I choose stuff, Panchayat has made a lot of sense to me, or the current one, Gram Chikitsalay. And I'm not saying that you watch them all with an awe, even Masan or Aligarh. I've watched them because they give you a lot of freedom to be critical about it. So these are movies where you come out and you talk, you have food for thought. It inspires you, keeps you thinking for many days कि ये होना चाहिए था कि नहीं होना चाहिए था, ये सही है कि ये गलत है. So जो लाइफ का एक नजरिया है वही आप मूवी में एक्सपीरियंस करते हो. एंड इवन द फन साइड ऑफ सच मूवीज, वेदर इट्स देवडी और दिल्ली बॉयज. So even those films basically do, even though they have again that critical sort of inquiry or space in it, but they entertain you left, right, and center. You can just pick up any scene and keep laughing. And I think those movies really stay on.
Those are some great recommendations, Ishita, and it's been very inspiring to talk to you, to know about your life journey. It's been a lot of food for thought, if I may say so, and I'm going to mull over all of the conversations that we had. And I hope everybody who's watching or listening into the conversation also gained a lot of perspective, a lot of new ideas that they can go back to. And thank you, Ishita, for joining us. It has been wonderful having you on Purpose.
Thank you so much for having me.